Now, John, this is a very interesting concession you've made, and an important one, that you were mistaken in having not gone to the Supreme Court. And there were lawyers within the administration who argued that you should go to the court, making the broad observation that over time, the court has tended to endorse presidential power when it's supported by Congress and strike it down when the president acts alone. What's so interesting about the 3 Supreme Court defeats you just got is that the most recent one struck down a law where you actually did go to Congress and did get congressional support. Wasn't that a terrible blow to presidential power? Did you so get the justices back up by making these broad claims that now that they've adopted an even more cramped and restrictive vision of presidential power than they would have had you gone in the first place?
Before I answer a question, is Justice O'Connor in the audience? No?
You're safe. Your secret is safe with us. We won't tell her.
Would you answer differently if she were?
Oh, yeah. Well, she's protected by a group of marshals. Let me say, the one thing we had done when I mean, it wasn't like we wanted to act in defiance of the Supreme Court at odds with it. We tried to read the existing cases and tried to predict what the court would do. And what we had seen, and maybe this was a mistake, because I think the war on terrorism is so different that maybe previous predictions just don't work, was that the courts had generally stayed out of any wartime cases until the conflict was coming to a conclusion. So the case that David mentions at the end of the Civil War, where the court said you can't use military commissions in the sort of peace of the home front areas, the court didn't decide that till, I think, 1866, right, until the hostilities were over. During the war, as Jeff, I think, quite rightly says, the court had always seemed to uphold presidential decisions, even those that were unilateral, such as Lincoln's actions at the start of the Civil War. So it is possible that we provoked a reaction in the court. I think another thing that changed significantly is that the role of the court has expanded, and I think the court now decides a lot of questions which used to be left up to the political process. Jeff, you've written about this too: abortion, affirmative action, religion, almost all the important values questions in society are, significantly, if not completely, within the control of the Supreme Court. I didn't think they would extend that to wartime issues too, and I agree, I was wrong on that. I never thought they would expand their powers to wartime questions. They never had before.
How much has presidential power suffered? Your former colleague, Jack Goldsmith, in his book says that Bush could have achieved all that he wanted to achieve and put it on firmer foundations if he'd been willing to reach out to other institutions of government. Instead, he weakened the presidency he was determined to strengthen so that no president in the future can have this attitude toward executive power because the other institutions of government won't allow it. On balance, did you leave presidential power weaker than when you came in?
I don't think so. I thought it was in pretty bad shape when we came in 2001 anyway. But I would say, I don't think that, first of all, I'd say a lot of the policies that Bush pursued unilaterally in the end are going to be approved by Congress or have been approved by Congress. Military commissions, Guantanamo Bay and habeas corpus, and the Surveillance Act look like it's going to pass when the Senate comes back in session. So I think if you just want to look at the substance of the policies, it looks like those are going to continue into the next administration. In terms of the balance of presidential power, I don't think so. I mean, I think that President Obama will still, as he said, use missiles to attack al-Qaeda safe houses in Pakistan without congressional approval, and I don't think anything that's happened in this war is going to prevent that from happening. I think that the president's still going to be able to vigorously pursue terrorists abroad. Now, I think politically it makes sense at times to consult with Congress when you don't reveal the facts of what you're going to do too much. But I really don't think that the next presidents are going to be handicapped in their ability to protect the national security. Let me also say, again, we're only talking about the context of emergencies, right? I'm not talking about sort of the normal peacetime relationship between the president and Congress. Or I think Dave's quite right. The Constitution gives all the power, the bulk of the power, 95% of the power to Congress. And I actually don't think Bush has really significantly changed the president's role in the administrative state or domestic policy either in a negative fashion.
David, what does history tell us about John's prediction that the future president will be also aggressive about executive power? Right now, the Democrats are exalting Congress and bashing Bush, but Clinton was no shrinking violet on executive power. Is it possible that President Obama, despite his strong criticism of Bush, might end up resembling him?
Well, look, there's a long-term secular trend in the evolution of the presidency just across the board, not just with respect to these highly important and highly sensitive civil liberties and civil rights issues we're talking about. The presidency has become a stronger institution over time. Again, if you just cast your minds back over whatever grade school history you might remember. I mean, we remember from the 19th century the names of 2 or 3 presidents maybe, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, then who remembers Harrison and Cleveland and all these other characters. The names we remember from the 19th century are the great congressional giants, Sumner, Calhoun, Clay, Webster, so on and so forth. And that tells us something, that the Congress was the place where large personalities and ambitious men could actually make their way. 20th century is a different story. I mean, the number of congressional names that we can easily recollect over the course of the 20th century is relatively few, but we remember a lot of presidents, Wilson, Roosevelt, the other Roosevelt, and so on and so forth. So there's a long-term secular trend here that I think is virtually impossible to reverse, and it's just given the nature of our governmental system and the nature of our society. And lest we forget, again, we're concentrating here on, quite rightly, I think, on these civil liberties issues. That's why you're here. But there's another dimension to this, which we haven't discussed, that maybe it'd be worth touching on, which is the war-making power, the power to deploy forces, as jacketed by the War Powers Act of 1973, which was one of these periodic congressional efforts. The neutrality statutes of the 1930s are another case study, where the Congress tries, usually after the horse has already left the barn, to close the door and somehow redefine congressional prerogatives in this area and limit presidential authority. The War Powers Act of 1973 passed over Richard Nixon's veto, and it has to do with whether the president is at liberty to send expeditionary forces overseas. And no president since has acknowledged its constitutionality. Can you imagine a scenario in which the Supreme Court will be asked to adjudicate the constitutionality of that act? What would that scenario look like, and what would be your guess as to the outcome?
I don't have to guess. There have been several suits that have tried to do that, often brought by senators and congressmen, which have usually been dismissed by the courts. But the case that would work, it just hasn't had the right course, is to find a soldier who doesn't want to go on the deployment. And that would get over I think the bars that the courts have usually used to try to avoid these cases. But it's very hard for me to imagine the Supreme Court issuing an order, say, stopping the Persian Gulf War, right in January 1991, which several lawsuits did try to do. This is an example where I think the court would try at its best just to say, if Congress doesn't want to do it, cut the funds off. Let me just say the funding power is a great power, because Congress, to wield it effectively, Congress doesn't have to do anything, right? If Congress just passes no law, the war can't go forward because there's no money for it. And I think that's really the sort of ultimate check that Congress has, is this power of the purse.